So we're going to continue with this story, again, of why faith formation is so difficult. And I think you see a little bit of a challenge as we take Marissa and her mom, if we allow those two to kind of be in some ways a kind of ideal type of where people are at. That the age of authenticity in many ways is a challenge to us. And I want to be really clear about what I mean by that. There is, like I said, some advantages to that, and there also are some losses in that. And I think it becomes very difficult for us to figure that out. One of the things we're going to push here, I had a few conversations at lunch that I want to be really clear about, is one of the things that the story Taylor is trying to tell is why belief in God, he thinks the kind of secular age we live in is where belief in any kind of God is completely optional. And I think he's right about that description. However, I think that puts a challenge on us, and it ups our need to be able to all the more be able to talk about God and God's action. Now, one of the things that the age of authenticity does is the advantage of it is it makes one's search, one's journey very important. And so I think we need to honor that in people, that people are on a search, people are looking for meaning. People's experience really matters. So I do think it has a challenge to us that we can't just simply drop doctrine in people's lap and think that that will be authoritative enough. But at the same time, people are deeply looking for meaning and significance, and often in the cultural context built on consumption and these kind of fleeting loves or intimacies. That's hard too, and so I think there's some ways forward, and we're going to get to those as we go here. But let's continue our story by going to these Durkheims. Again, don't get tripped up on Durkheim. Just know that he's a sociologist, and he's looking to see how religion functions within larger societies. And it's helpful then to take our religious professionals through this. And so the first of the Durkheims is what Taylor calls Paleo-Durkheim. Now, when I hear paleo, I don't know about you, maybe this is just a completely American phenomenon, but I think of the paleo diet. Was there a paleo diet in Scotland? Yeah. So, to take the paleo diet is to eat like a cave person and to eat just nuts and berries and dirt, I think. I don't know what else you eat. But that's not necessarily what Taylor means. He doesn't mean kind of paleo as in kind of early hominids or something like that. He just basically means the kind of religion that functioned during the ancient regime, where it was just so deeply embedded that you couldn't really even imagine yourself outside of some kind of religious understanding of yourself. Now, what's fascinating to me is across the world where I've been, almost no kind of denominational officials, no religious professionals are ever saying, man, how could we get back to a Paleo-Durkheimian age? Like, how could we get back to the ancient regime? If we could just turn back the clock. There's a lot of stuff, at least in the religious communities, the faith communities I'm in, where people wish that we could get back to something that we've lost, but almost no one wants to get back to a kind of ancient regime, Paleo-Durkheimianism. It's actually almost really hard for us to think of what that would look like. I mean, we're so fully in our modern era, we have a really hard time. Now, of course, there is a thought experiment of what it would be like after modernity to go back to something like the ancient regime in the Paleo-Durkheimianism. And this thought experiment that became a TV show won a few Emmys, at least. It's a little TV show called The Handmaid's Tale. Do you guys get The Handmaid's Tale in Scotland? Freaky dark show. I mean, if you want nightmares or just to feel weird, just watch this show. But it's a fascinating show because it's about basically America falls apart, and in its place this new nation arises from really right-wing fundamentalist Christians called Gilead. But you see how it is the ancient regime or a Paleo-Durkheimianism. The way you dress, the way you address one another is all infused with religious meaning. So in this context, when you see somebody, you have to say under his eye. And every different distinction in the hierarchy of life is a different dress, the way you talk, the way you go to the store. Everything is embedded in a religious identity. Again, there's no reason to do faith formation. The whole society forms faith. No denominational official I've talked to in the most conservative Christian denominations, the most liberal ones, has ever said, let's get back to something like The Handmaid's Tale. No one wants that. And I think probably for some good reasons. So if no religious professional really wants to get to the Paleo-Durkheimian, I think at least again, I'll just talk for my country. When I talk to people in denominations, people in leadership, really where they get embedded is in what Taylor calls the Neo-Durkheimian. Now, when I think of Neo, I don't know what you think of. this makes me really lame to even say this, but I think of the Matrix, when Neo comes out of his cocoon and he is new, he's revived, he's Neo. So Neo has this kind of sense of revived or kind of new to it. And I think this is where most people are at. And it's connected. You can see how these kind of map onto each other, but not quite, because they kind of produce each other. But the Neo-Durkheimian is really connected to the age of mobilization in the sense that the Neo-Durkheimian is something that you have to choose to connect to, that you have to mobilize your life in this way. Now, what I think is fascinating, and Taylor talks about this, is that the religious form in the Neo-Durkheimian is not the Handmaid's Tale. It really is the denomination. The denomination is a mobilized form of religious expression. And no more so, I think, again, you please push back against this as we have our discussion, but really America particularly is the land of the denomination. And whenever there's just fights, you just start a new denomination. You just start a new church and a new denomination. But it is in a sense too, because there's this kind of American individualism where we can just gather people and we can just decide to create something new. We can mobilize our lives in a different way. But that spreads. Any society that has kind of is in the age of mobilization or is somewhat still in the age of mobilization, the denomination becomes the kind of way we live this out. Now, denominations do some really good things for us in this, is that they tend to move religion to be more of kind of a private reality. And it allows us to inherit a world where we don't really need to necessarily kill each other anymore. At least most people don't think that way. In the ancient regime, I mean, a chance for a 30 years war or just a religious battle is pretty ripe. It could happen at any time. The age of mobilization leads to some kind of form of peace, but it does that by moving religion as a completely private matter. So I can live next to someone who is a Methodist and I'm a Presbyterian, and I feel really no need to kill them. I mean, I don't. Well, if they don't cut their lawn a certain way, maybe I will. But, I get more upset, actually, if their dog poops on my lawn than I get by their having a different religious perspective. Because for the most part, I think we're the same. It's just that I mobilize my life in a Presbyterian way, and they mobilize their own individual life in a Methodist way, or maybe in a Jewish way, or whatever. So you can have rivalry. There can be rivalry at times, but there doesn't need to necessarily be this zero-sum fight, which is in advance. That rivalry can become heated, and that's why, what do we say, at least in America, we say the things you shouldn't talk about at a dinner party. You don't talk about politics, you don't talk about sex, and you don't talk about religion, because those are private things that are someone's own private way of mobilizing their life, and it's impolite to raise that. So you can have rivalry. The other way to kind of make this maybe click a little bit is you have to be in an age of mobilization to get something like the modern Olympics or the World Cup. You can't have the World Cup or a modern Olympics until you're in an age of mobilization. You have to pretty much assume, you can't get like the Champions League without it kind of being in a sense of mobilization. You can't, you look at Germans and you can think, well, for the most part, Germans are just like me. They just mobilize their life in a kind of German way. And so then we can have rivalry around our football teams, but but for the most part, we're the kind of same kind of people. So you can have these kind of rivalries, and it's no wonder the first World Cup is like in the 1920s. The first modern Olympics is at the very, very end of the 19th century, like after 1895 or something, that you need a kind of age of mobilization to get to that. Now, where that connects to religion and faith is that denominations then do need something. Denominations need loyalty, because it's about mobilizing your private life in a certain way. So this becomes a huge issue for people who are asked to curate or asked to steward denominations, is how do you get people to invest in it? How do you get them to mobilize their lives in a certain way? How do you get them to be loyal to it? And I'm speaking only for my country here, but I think youth ministry particularly has a problem of kind of dying on this horn, where it's really been funded in for trying to perpetuate denominational loyalty more than it's really been about how do we help a generation encounter the living Jesus Christ and Jesus' words to actually follow. So to give you an example of that, and this I can say this because I'm thousands of miles away from home. But the seminary I teach at is very confusing. The seminary I teach at is in a Lutheran denomination called the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America. Now what's confusing about that is when you think of evangelical, like the evangelicals voted for Trump, the ELCA, which is the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, is not part of that sociological group. They are a mainline denomination. Evangelical for them means back to the Protestant Reformation in the sense of evangelical. Very confusing. But this denomination has a thing every 3 years they call the youth gathering. And it is for Lutheran young people, and they spend over $1 million, close to $2 million on this every 3-year event where all of these high school kids come. It's in a big sports arena. There's over 10,000 young people. Sometimes they get even closer to 20,000 young people. And it's a big, big deal. Now, I was at it a few years ago doing some presentations for the youth workers, and I was walking down the hall, and there was these two probably 16-year-old girls in front of me. And they were good friends, and one of them did the kind of thing where you're next to your friend and you kick them while they're there, just playfully kind of kicked her. And I listened to this whole conversation. She kicked her, and the other girl goes, that was rude. And then she said this, she said, that's such an un-Lutheran thing to do. And I realized that $1 million was really well spent. Because what happened is she was spending a whole week in this big dome event with speakers and concerts, and they were looking around and seeing all these other Lutherans, and it was building in denominational loyalty. But what's fascinating is her friend hits her, and she doesn't think, well, that's rude. That's a rude thing to do, or that's a unchristian thing to do. Maybe would have made more sense. Like, she didn't kick her and say, you're saved by works alone. That would have been un-Lutheran. That would have been an un-Lutheran thing to do. But that's not what she did. So she was so kind of taken into the event that she recognized that the point of it, kind of unknowing to her, the point of it was to give her some kind of loyalty in the denomination. Now, I'm not saying that's bad. I'm not saying that's bad at all. But it can work better when people come with a certain presumption, people come with a kind of unthought, a kind of background sense that there is a living God that moves in their lives. Now, when they don't have that, and that's kind of the point I'm getting to, is in this kind of secular age, the culture continues to make it harder for people to recognize that there isn't a living God in our cultural context. And then all of a sudden, when it seems like the point here is to get you to be a committed Lutheran, we'll just stick with the Lutheran so we can throw rocks at people who aren't here. When you're just a committed Lutheran, it can really start to feel banal. Like, what's the point of this? Or what's this actually about? But this becomes a real struggle for denominational leaders, particularly in my country where we basically all budgets of all denominations and all churches have to be raised from the people there. I mean, this becomes a huge deal. Like, there will be no health insurance. I mean, again, now I'm confessing how terrible the health insurance is in my country. But there will be no health insurance unless we can be a block that can buy it. So what are you going to do? There'll be no seminaries. We need people to invest in this. So this becomes a pretty big deal. And so almost all these kind of religious professionals that I was talking with, I think when I was talking to them on the phone, really what they were asking is, how can we engage people in a way that they'll be loyal to this, that they'll invest in this institution? How can we do this? And I think for most of them, again, just going to own this in my country, never move past this kind of Neo-Durkheimian perspective. Now let me say one more thing before I push us forward in this. What's really interesting about America here, and shows you some of the weird peculiarities of America, is that the whole American reality, and then Taylor calls this the American exception, because one of the things that's very strange about America is in many ways out of the Western countries we remain the quote-unquote most religious, and yet at the same time the most secular. Because it's so deeply built within our political just structure that the separation of church and state is so full on that you can't even have a third grade teacher really reference God without getting in trouble. But at the same time, then you get every president, even Donald Trump, may God have mercy on our souls, we won't go any further, but you have even Donald Trump saying during the election that his favorite book is the Bible. Now, I'm sure Donald Trump's never opened the Bible, but he has to say that because there's this sense that to be a true good American is some kind of connection to a religious context. Now, Taylor's point as a Canadian looking in is he's saying one of the reasons for that, there may be 3 or 4, but a big one is in the American consciousness, there is really no connection back to the ancient regime in any way. America has this illusion that we deeply live out of, that we created ourselves within the age of mobilization, that we just made ourselves. And to show you how deeply that even goes with me, I flew into Canada about a year ago, and I went into British Columbia and went into Kelowna, this beautiful little town in British Columbia, and I went through customs, and I went to Seattle and then into Kelowna and went through customs, and there at the customs passport control in Canada was a picture of the Queen. And it was just like, what? It felt so strange to me as an American. And I just felt like, Canada, I know you so well. Like, we hang out together, and this connection, it was just a very, very strange thing. And I'm just trying to say that the illusion here is so much that America kind of creates itself from nothing before it. And that reality allows, Taylor says, for the American exception, where religion really does have this perspective, even as it's declining. It has this perspective that religion belongs to the people. It's grassroots. So you need George W. Bush, or you need even Obama, or you need Trump to say, well, look at me, I'm a regular guy, I go to church too. That they need to say that because in some ways it's always been seen as the people's, whether it has been or not. But even in America, we still become really caught in this denominational reality of trying to kind of win loyalty for it. One of the more kind of grotesque sides of this that I think is a real problem that's happened in the States is we've realized that the denominations that are faring the best, and by faring the best I mean sociologically, seem to be most giving, seem to be able to retain people, shockingly tend to be the ones who have deep boundaries of an immigrant community, tend to be to do away with egalitarian, have very high gender structures. Those seem to, quote unquote, be doing the best. Again, why? Well, from a sociological perspective, you can build more loyalty when you close those boundaries down in a significant way. But it also becomes, in an odd way, a violation of the age of authenticity in its own perspective. So as we push forward, then we enter into what is Taylor calls the Post-Durkheimian age. Now, I don't know if it was true in Scotland, but in the States, particularly like 2005 and on, maybe even earlier than that, every conversation with pastors particularly was about how we were now in a postmodern era. And it was postmodern this, postmodern that, and I think people choked on it. It was obscure and weird, because post-structuralism is really about an epistemology and how we know these things. And pastors, at least in my country, held on to that conversation for a long time and were engaged in it. But I think the element they were engaged in was not really about kind of philosophical epistemology as much as really about a post-Durkheimian perspective. They're living in a world now where people don't necessarily feel like they have to mobilize their lives in this way, that they're free from that. And I'll show you a little bit in a minute what that actually looks like and what that means for us. But again, I just say this as an analog that maybe helps get you thinking about the Scottish context, which I don't know enough about. But this also maybe gives you a picture of America. What's really fascinating, I think, about the American context is that we, across evangelicals and the main line, are at cross purposes. And what I mean by that is we have all these denominations really committed, the mainline denominations, again, the Presbyterians, the Lutherans, the Episcopalians, who are committed to kind of a Neo-Durkheimian thing. They want to keep the denomination strong. They want it to be significant. But when it comes to this, are fully engaged in an age of authenticity. And it actually, I'm not sure it can work. When you have a really strict sense of the age of authenticity, that every human being has a right to define for themselves what it means to be human for themselves, but you need them to commit and be loyal to an institution that has to set some kind of parameters of what it means to be in that community, it would be really hard. And we are about 20, 30 years of trying this experiment, and it hasn't held off very well. And as we get into these debates, we almost want to double down on that. What's interesting about evangelicals in America is they're almost in a different way. They are much more open to kind of post-Durkheimian structures, big megachurches, smaller groups, more kind of creative ways. You think when Saddleback Church was created in the 80s, you know, Saddleback Church and Rick Warren's church, that he deliberately got funding from the Southern Baptists, but did everything he could to put that, not have that be a vocal piece. You can barely find it on the website. It's not there because his idea was that he wanted to connect to people who were searching for purpose and meaning, and he knew they didn't care about a denomination. They cared about finding a collective, finding a church that could give them resources to work on their self, to find their own purpose. So the evangelicals in America have done a much better job of having quote-unquote, again, I mean, kind of quote-unquote cutting ways of doing this, but they also tend to be wanting more of the age of mobilization. So they're at a different cross purpose. And it's been a huge issue now because, like I said, more conservative Protestants supported Trump, and you have people like Jerry Falwell Jr., you have all the rhetoric from the religious right on, is that we're trying to make America great again. It really is in many ways this kind of age of mobilization perspective, and the religious right from the 1980s has been talking about a Christian America, which really never existed in the first place. But so they're trying to get back to that. And it's a huge, huge struggle in America that we are at these kind of cross purposes. And I think this will become a challenge for all religious traditions across the West, which is how will we create these communities, or do we have to move on? But how do we kind of get these things lined up? Because they're not really lined up. Does that make any kind of sense, how these kind of cross purposes are there? And so it's a huge issue in where I teach, where the more we are open to the age of authenticity, the harder it is to give any rationale for why you need to go to a faith community. And again, if you can't give a theological rationale, and by theological I don't mean a doctrinal, but one that helps people imagine the living presence of Jesus Christ calling them into a way of life, it becomes a really difficult thing. And that's what makes faith formation very, very difficult. All right, so we get into this post-Durkheimian perspective, but this is where these things come together. And I don't know if you've been to like Disneyland or something like that, where if we get on a ride like Magic Mountain or whatever, and they say, if you are prone to epileptic seizures or you're pregnant, please do not go on this ride. This is my warning on my next slide. I start to bring these things together, and I hope it doesn't make you vomit. But these things come together like this, as we put these both into conversation, is that first of all, we see that our religious professionals really are in the kind of, at least the ones I know in my country, are in the Neo-Durkheimian perspective, and that's somewhere very different than Marissa and her mom. But what they do kind of share is what Taylor has called the immanent frame. And what he means by that is that all of us in the West, kind of in the background noise of our lives, we live more in an immanent realm than what he would say a transcendent realm. Or we could think of it, we live in more of a natural world than a supernatural world. The ancient regime, people all presumed the kind of world they were living in was a supernatural one. Supernatural stuff happened all the time. That's why if your church had the crown of thorns of Jesus, I mean, it could heal you. This is why when Thomas Becket was made a saint, all sorts of people traveled to his grave and actually got blood, carried his blood around. And if you were sick, you could put a little Thomas Becket's blood in your drink and it would heal you. There's this idea, and that wasn't illogical. That didn't make you a crazy person. That was the kind of order you lived in, supernatural realities. All of us, even good church-going people, tend to think, if we heard that, we'd think, that's nuts. That's crazy. That's weird. Because we do presume more of a natural than a supernatural order. So we live in what he calls the immanent frame. This is what Taylor says about the immanent frame. He says the immanent frame is a constructed social space that frames our lives entirely within a natural rather than a supernatural order. It is a circumscribed space of the modern social imaginary that precludes transcendence. What I would want to say, transcendence, I think it precludes divine action, the sense that God is acting and moving in the world. And that's what makes faith formation such a challenge, is it's hard for people to imagine that there is a living God, there's a personal reality calling their person into action. And I think that becomes a huge move of ministries. How do we help our people imagine that? How do we help them have a sense of that? How do we help them hear that call in a significant way? Now, to put our feet a little bit more on the ground, let me give you a pop culture example. And this comes from an older song, but from Lily Allen. You know Lily Allen, the kind of irreverent pop star. And this is from her song, The Fear. This is the lyrics. She says, "Life's more about film stars and less about mothers. But it doesn't matter because I'm packing plastic, and that's what makes my life so effing fantastic." Now, you should always be wary of exegeting pop stars' lyrics, so I'm not exactly sure what that means. I'm not sure what packing plastic means. It could mean she has a credit card with a really big credit limit on it. More than likely, it means she has had her breasts enhanced, and that means that her life is fantastic. That becomes the measure of it. But here's where the immanent frame comes in. Her next line, she says, "I'm a weapon of massive consumption. It's not my fault. It's how I'm programmed to function," echoing our first presentation. Consumption is how I create my identity. But here's the immanent frame. Hopefully you can see that. It's coming off the screen a little bit. She says, "I'm not a saint, but I'm not a sinner. Now everything's cool as long as I'm getting thinner." Now let me say that again. Now I'm not a saint, but I'm not a sinner. But everything's cool as long as I'm getting thinner. That is the immanent frame articulated directly how we experience it in our culture. What keeps her up at night, what leads her to be anxious, is not, where am I eternally destined for? What does God think of me? Does God think I'm a saint or I'm a sinner? How would I be a saint? What would that mean for me? She doesn't care. I mean, just think about how different that is to go back to right around 1517 when Luther nails his 95 Theses on the door at Wittenberg. Everyone, at least in continental Europe at that time, is absolutely anxious about, are they bound for heaven or hell? Are they a saint or are they a sinner? They will walk days and days and days to venerate saints. That was the big question. And so Luther has this incredible theological breakthrough that pushes forth the Reformation, incredibly relevant theological moment next to people's lived experience, where he comes with his simile. That you actually, the great breakthrough of him rereading Romans is that you are actually simultaneously saint and sinner. That you are both sinner and out of your sinfulness, God acts for you, and through Jesus Christ makes you saint. Incredibly culturally relevant at the time. But what do? And you do live in a secular age when 15-year-olds, 25-year-olds, 45-year-olds, 65-year-olds don't care. And they don't not care maliciously. They just don't think about it. But what keeps Lily Allen up at night, what makes her wake up in a cold sweat, is knowing that it's swimsuit season and how people are going to actually look at her body. That keeps her up. And that's a completely immanent, natural reality, not a transcendent. And that becomes a huge challenge. Why is faith formation so hard? Because we live in this immanent frame. I hope you're hearing me say how important I think theological reflection becomes, and how important it is for the pastor, the minister, the youth worker to be a theological thinker and help people imagine the depth of God's action. But it is not easy. And just having advanced theological degrees and knowing doctrine will not be enough. Doctrine has to live next to people's search and people's experience. And the immanent frame becomes a huge challenge within that. So this becomes the challenge we have of this immanent frame. So Taylor says this: we can't help looking over our shoulders from time to time, looking sideways, living our faith in a condition of doubt and uncertainty. One of the beautiful things about Taylor is that Taylor says there's no believer in the modern world who is not struck by doubt. He'd say, well, maybe there's some. They're called, really hardcore fundamentalists, but they're very, very, very small few. Any believer in this modern age, in this kind of secular age we live in, will be thrust into doubt. And we should admit that. And our community should become places where people can articulate that, where people can say once in a while, I think I believe this. I really do. But sometimes I wonder, is this just because I grew up in this family? Is this because I was just born in Scotland? Is this just some kind of psychological transference? It becomes nearly impossible to be an honest human being living in this world and not be struck by those questions once in a while. And if our religious communities can't be open to them, even if our clergy and our leaders can't once in a while admit that, there's something kind of disingenuous in this. That's why I said talk about the ones who wrestle with God, wrestling with our own doubts. But here's the other beautiful thing that opens up a window for us of hope, I think, is that Taylor says that every believer sometimes doubts in this kind of secular age, but every doubter sometimes believes in the secular age. And I think that's a beautiful thing. Taylor is no reductionist. He actually thinks the human spirit needs something bigger than what our modern world has given us. But he says sometimes every doubter. So go out to the streets of Glasgow, find a 28-year-old, find a 35-year-old, say, you believe in all the stuff the church says? No, that's some ancient crap. No, I don't need that. I don't need that in my life. I'm living a good life. I think I'm a moral, upstanding person. Nah, I don't think so. So what do you think human life's about? Listen, there's no meaning out there. You live, you die, you find your own meaning. That's all it's about. Taylor says those people exist. A lot of them exist. He says, but those people too, once in a while, have some certain experiences. For instance, their first child is born. And they hold that baby for the first time, and all of a sudden it comes up the back of their neck, and they find themselves saying, oh shit. Literally, they have to change the diaper. But they say, oh no, like maybe this isn't just evolutionary psychological wiring. Maybe there's something more here. Maybe there's something deeper here. Or that one night they have too much to drink, and maybe the drink has loosened them up a little bit, and they hear that song, and they just know there's something calling out to them. There's something more significant. So every believer doubts, but sometimes every believer believes. So there's only another small group that never, ever believes, and those are kind of the Richard Dawkins types. But those are very, very few people that exist on every side. The fundamentalists who never doubt, and the kind of Richard Dawkins parts who never believe. But most of us in this modern world are believers who sometimes doubt, or are doubters who sometimes believe. And there's great opportunity there, especially if we can start to articulate the depth of our stories of why we believe. And one of my big pushes here, especially as we have a discussion, is that this becomes an incredible time to use an old Christian word that we need to recover, which is actually testimony. We need to be able to tell our stories of our encounters with the living God, and to tell them in the humility of deep belief and deep doubt. And I tell youth workers all the time, if there's one thing that I hope, we're all into counting. And especially when we're in this kind of Neo-Durkheimian age, it's amazing how much we count. And often in my country, youth workers are hired in the first place because people have been counting and the numbers are down. So they're going to spend big money to hire a youth worker, like $10,000, and pay this person, a very minimal price. But the idea is, listen, we better get 10, 15, 25% return on this. That's the point. So if you start with 15 young people in your youth group or whatever you call it, if we're going to invest, less than $20,000, make you work 60 hours a week and pay you for 5, we expect that a year from now, you're going to have 20, 22. And if you don't, we're going to wonder, well, was this worth our investment? So counting becomes a huge thing in a Neo-Durkheimian age. Now don't get me wrong, counting can tell us a story. Numbers do tell us a story. Mark DeVries, who's a youth ministry guy in the United States, tells a great funny story about, if he takes his own 3 biological children to an amusement park, and he comes back to the car at the end of the day, and he's only got 2 out of the 3, and his wife says, "Where's our 3rd kid?" An appropriate response is not to say, "Hey, listen, I'm not into numbers. I'm about something more." Like, numbers do tell us a story, so I'm not trying to say, declining numbers justifies that. But there are other deeper stories. And I think a number to actually count, maybe in all ministry, but particularly in youth ministry, is to say, when our young people move through our program, are part of our church, we want them to hear 10, 15 stories, 20 stories of people in the congregation who in fear, in trembling, in doubt, in great hope, are living out this faith. And they need to hear the stories of people, like the kind of classic testimony of people who are like, my life was terrible. I was a high school teacher. I got cancer. I found myself on the hard streets of Albuquerque, New Mexico. I found a former student. We started to cook meth. I made it blue. They called me Heisenberg. And then I found Jesus. All right, I'm recapping Breaking Bad, right? All right, so they need those kind of proverbial testimonies of my life was terrible and now my life is great again because I found Jesus. Those are important. Those are an incredible blessing to the church. But young people, or all people, also need stories where people stand up and say things like, okay, you 11 to 18-year-olds, you know me. I've been in this church for 12 years. But I'm not at a good place right now. And then this person might say, some of you know my little daughter, and I know you're reading this text right now for Romans, that God works all the things out for the good of those who love God. I think I believe that, but then again, I'm not sure. You see my daughter around church. For 2 years, we had to figure out what was wrong with her, some issue. We finally figured out that she has this genetic condition. Now every night, 3:30, my phone goes off, the alarm on my phone goes off. And I have to get up, and I have to go into her room, draped in pink. And I have to grab her little arm, and I have to shake her awake enough that I can stick a needle in her arm. And every night that happens, she squeals. And every night at 3:30, that alarm goes off, and I know I have to go hurt my own little daughter. I don't know what this text means. Right now, I'm not so sure God's working anything out for good. When she squeals every night, I wonder what's good. But I'm here. I could use your prayers. And I'll be back next week. But I got to tell you right now, I sit in the back of that church, and I think to myself, what's going on? They need to hear those stories. And I think a lot of what pastoral ministry is setting the environment for those stories to be shared. That faith is really passed on, not through doctrine, but through the stories of God's people who need doctrine to frame their experience. We deeply need doctrine, but doctrine frames these experiences that helps us articulate the absence and the presence of God in our lives. And often the presence of God in and through the seeming absence of God, that God breaks forth in those very experiences. That's what we need desperately. And that, I think, opens up the immanent frame in a very significant way. So what happens in what I've been telling you these stories about really is what Taylor calls cross pressure. And this is one of the very fascinating things he thinks about modernity. One of the lies of modernity is, listen, we've outgrown God, we don't need God, it's not a problem for anyone anymore. His point of modernity is a conflicted thing, is that we often feel very conflicted. Like we have freedom from all these things, but then we wonder, is there any meaning out there? And he calls this cross pressure, that all of us feel cross pressure. Like when I said the doubter is sure that all we are, these organic beings. Yeah, we have extended consciousness, but that extended consciousness is just to keep us alive. We know all that, but then you hold that baby, and what happens is you get crossed up. You find yourself crossed up thinking there must be more meaning here. So there is a great reality here that people across our cultural context are often getting crossed up. But they need someone to be with them, to share with them, to be in relationship with them around these crossed up experiences. And actually, Lily Allen gets crossed up herself, because this is her chorus. She says, I don't know what's right or what's real anymore. I mean, it's interesting. She's not saying what's right or wrong. She's saying what's right or real. What is reality? Is there something more out there? I don't know how I'm meant to feel anymore. Again, listen to feel there. She's trying to search for meaning. When do you think it will all become clear because I'm being overtaken by the fear? So this incredibly irreverent thing of, I'm not saying I'm going to sin, but everything's cool as long as I'm getting thinner. She gets crossed up and wonders, is there anything real out there? Is there any meaning? What's right? What's right? Where do I stand in the midst of this? So people are getting crossed up all the time. And people deeply, I think, need communities that will teach them to pray. Deeply need communities of pastors who will proclaim a word to them. But proclaim a word next to this deep search of where is their meaning? Where is God in this? How do I make sense of this? And that often will suffer with them in and through these experiences. So to push this just a little bit further, what Taylor thinks happens is that this cross pressure, and this kind of happens into the 60s really, and we see this then into the 70s, 80s, and we're living in it now, is that this cross pressure of authenticity, find your search, find meaning, and this kind of deep sense that that kind of organized religion can't provide that, is what happens is these things chafe against each other and they explode. And they explode into what he calls the Nova effect. And what he means by a Nova effect is all these third ways of finding spirituality. So in my country, there's all this research on being spiritual but not religious. But it's a much deeper phenomenon than that. It's that people now are free. Most people, especially middle-class people, but beyond middle-class people, they all want to have a spiritual dynamic to their life. It's really kind of culturally, it's not a real legitimate way to live without a kind of spiritual dynamic to your life, again, unless you're one of those Richard Dawkins people. But people don't think they need to go to any kind of organized religious form. They need to go to any congregation to find religion in their life. So people will say, well, my religion, my spirituality is fishing, or yoga, or getting my kid into an Oxbridge school. That's what gives me meaning, that's what gives me drive. So all these third forms arise. And this becomes what he means by the Post-Durkheimian, is that these all become legitimate ways to live your life out. And so that becomes like a whole new challenge to us. And that leads us into my last triad. And what time did we say we were going to be done? 15 minutes, perfect. I always lose track of all time up here, so I apologize. That leads us into the last triad, which I hopefully summarizes this, and this can launch us into our small group discussions and then our conversation together. And this is what Taylor calls the seculars. And I think this is a helpful way for us to think about what it really means to be living in a secular age. And I think it makes what you do in ministry really important. So if we think of secular zero, and this is me kind of adding to Taylor because I think he's confusing here, but you just think of secular zero as like the classic way we think of secular, as a kind of divide here between what's sacred and what's profane. So like back in the ancient regime, the priest's robe was a sacred thing. The farmer's hoe or shovel was a secular thing. So the first move into being secular is when we have this divide between the public and the private. And we could call that secular one. So just keep those as kind of big concepts here. What becomes important for us, I think, in what we do, is that we often get trapped, and I think this happens so much, I'm just going to own this for my country. So much of the conversation across youth ministry, but across the church, really gets caught in what's called a secular two context. And by secular two, what Taylor means is to kind of think about this as religious versus a-religious. And so it's the sense that the a-religious or the secular spheres are growing and the religious are shrinking. Now this is American response is always to try to win back space. And partly it is because that divide between church and state, there always seems to be a kind of competition and an entrepreneurial spirit of who can grow this space. But this is really, if you read a lot of the American youth ministry stuff about faith formation, it really is about how do we get kids to stick? How do we get them to stay? How do we get them to actually be here? How do we get them to choose coming to church instead of going to football practice? How do we get them to see a youth group or the mission trip as just as important as the debate club or even their exam prep? How do we do that? Now, what Taylor would say to us is that's important. For everyone in this room, secular too is an important thing. I already kind of have said this. For me, particularly in my country, while our denominations shrink anymore, we will be closing seminaries. We will not be able to buy health care. It will be hard to even have full-time pastors. It's a huge issue and a huge financial issue. But what I think is really important for us to recognize is that that's not what it necessarily means to live in a secular age. It does affect us. But what it really means to live in a secular age is what he calls secular three. And secular three is that sense, that belief in a transcendent God, belief in a God who acts and moves. The thought that, like the Reformers believed, both Luther and Calvin knew how God acted. That God acted in a certain way, and their whole theological system is built around this. They knew how God acted. God acts through word. God speaks. That's how God acts. Their systems are built around that. But what happens when you're in a cultural context where it seems bizarre and weird to assume that you could hear God speak to you? If you want to read a really interesting book, there's a book by a sociologist, she's actually an anthropologist named Tanya Lerman, T.M. Lerman, called When God Talks Back. And she's really going into a Pentecostal tradition and talking to these people who hear God speak to them and then deciding if they're crazy or not. And she actually discovers that they're not. It has no kind of correlations to schizophrenia. It has nothing like that. And she kind of comes at the end of the book saying there's something that these people recognize. She says, I'm not saying I believe it or not. I'm a secular anthropologist. But she said you can't call it schizophrenia. But her point is we live in a cultural context where we have a small group of people who believe God speaks to them. And sometimes we, even in the Christian community, jokingly say speaks to them about really benign things, like what kind of jeans to buy. But then we have a whole other group of people who think that it's absurd to think that God talks. That's a far way away from the Reformation traditions that believe God speaks. God speaks to you. God's word speaks. The preacher represents God's spoken word. It's completely different kind of cultural context here. So the point is the secular three is when that becomes unbelievable to people as a kind of knee-jerk reaction. Now, I think one of the ways forward that we can talk about as we have some discussion is Taylor says you have options in this kind of secular three. You have options in the immanent frame. And one of the options, and this is where you see Taylor's believing Catholic commitments, is he says your options are one of two. You can, inside of this immanent frame, none of us get to escape the immanent frame. We all live in it. But you can have a closed spin. You can spin it closed. And this is where he reveals his cards. When he means spin, he means something like a news pundit or a political operative telling a story that spins things closed. He actually doesn't think the human spirit can live in a closed world. He thinks art, poetry, all this stuff shows us that we reach for something more, that there's something out there that we long for. But you can. And, people have sold millions and millions of books, the Dentons, the Dawkins, having closed spins, spinning things closed, telling people that this is just hardwiring that we're going to outgrow. That's an option. The other option, he thinks, is inside the immanent frame, is you can have an open take. You can have an open take. Now, what's fascinating about that, I've said fascinating too many times around Taylor, but I find him fascinating, is that it's a take. None of us can sit here, none of us can lead our churches beyond anything than a take. You don't get to. You don't get to be in the ancient regime and say, I know this 100%, this is true. All you can do is, in many ways, in humility, which I think is representative of some of the virtues that Paul is even leading us into, is in humility say, this is what I believe. This is how I make sense of this world. This is what this community believes. Yeah, we doubt it. Yeah, it seems absurd at times. But this is our take. And we actually invite you to bring your take in here too. And we can actually have a conversation. And in this cultural context, it's fair to say, I don't buy it. But even as Christians, we should be able to say that back to other people who have different takes. I don't buy it. I just don't buy it. And I don't buy it. Why? Not because I think my ideas are pure, but I can't buy that God's not out moving in the world, because when my community prayed for me, I found new life out of death. I can't believe that there's no meaning here, because I remember when my grandma prayed for me. Like, those confessions become huge. So you can have this open take or a closed spin. So in humility, we all have to say, this is just a take. But that's what faith is. Faith is a take that God is calling us and moving us into something. And so there's a beautiful way forward in that. If we had more time, I'd show you this whole movie, because I think it's an underrated, really interesting movie. You should stream it. It's called Jeff Who Lives at Home, about Jeff, who's played by Jason Segel, who's on the left here, and then Ed Helms is his older brother. And basically, Jeff just lives in the basement. And what's happened to Jeff and to Ed Helms' character is that their father has died. And Jason Segel lives this life, and he seems like an odd person, but he lives this life thinking there's got to be meaning. There's got to be some reason this happened. Ed Helms, so that's the open take. Ed Helms' character has closed spin. He says the only point of life is to get a Porsche, buy a Porsche. That's the only thing that matters, get a promotion. There's nothing else in the world other than acquiring some consumer goods and being happy. But Segel's character, Jeff, wants to find deep meaning here. And it just becomes this beautiful articulation of these two ways of actually being. And what's beautiful at the end is that this sense that there's meaning out there, that there's something, that there's some kind of transcendent reality calling to him, actually leads Jeff to sacrifice himself to save others, to have a deep sense of his own narrative. And there's this beautiful scene in a cemetery that kind of sums it up, where they both, because these things have happened, end up together in the cemetery, and there's their father's grave. And Ed Helms' character kind of has a moment where he kind of talks about a dream he had of his dad, and that his dad says something to him in this dream. And then Jeff kind of tears up and says, I have dreams too. And Dad says that to me in my dreams as well. And Ed Helms' character says, it must have been something Dad said to us. It must not mean anything. It must just be a weird kind of neurological firing or something. And Jeff's point is, no, don't. Why? Why can't you see that there's something more here? There's something calling us out. And it does actually lead him at the end of the movie to take an incredible act to care and show mercy and love and sacrifice himself for others. This sense that there's something more calling to him. What it actually does is it leads him into being a minister in the world. And I think maybe this is a huge way forward in these kind of open takes, is to help people both articulate their experiences of, and their experiences that they've received and that they've given of ministry, of feeling ministered to or ministering to another. That those become moments that break us open to deep significance, to telling these stories of where another person was deeply there for us, and how that felt like God was present in the midst of that, or how they were called deeply into something. I think if you could easily happen in one of your congregations where you give people a chance to tell one of those stories. And you have a young woman who says, you might know that I'm a school teacher. And I had an experience last year where there was a girl in my class, in my third grade class, and I had found out that her parents were going through a divorce. And it was after their time outside, their recess period, and I was lining my students back up and we couldn't find her. And I had a moment of panic, but then I could see her feet inside the slide. So I told my teaching assistant to take my class in. And I went to the slide and I told her to come down, and I didn't have anything to say. But she was crying and she was upset. And I just sat there with her for a few minutes. And then I looked at her and I said, I know this is hard. And I said, if you ever need to talk, I'm here. I went back to my office, and at the end of the day, I was grading papers and something just came over me. And I felt like God used me. I felt like there was something bigger that my life was about. I felt like Jesus was using me in a significant way. And there's experience of her ministering to someone else that becomes this opening. And to have spaces for people in communities to share those stories. Or to say, I had to travel. I had to travel to London because my father was sick. And I got to that gate, and I couldn't take it. It just hit me. And I sat in this chair waiting for my flight, and I just cried. And the next thing I know, there was someone sitting next to me. And they just touched my knee, and then they were gone 15 minutes later. Man, that felt like the presence of Christ. Man, when we read the text of the road to Emmaus, it reminds me of that experience. That I felt that when God ministered deeply to me. That becomes this deep, open take, I think. One final story, and then I'm going to be done. Right on time, Susie. So I had an experience a few years ago where I was doing some research for my book, Christopraxis, and I was basing it off the T.M. Lerman book that I just told you, where people that there were significant people who felt like God spoke to them, like God led them into something. And I wondered what that would be like talking to Lutherans and Presbyterians. Would they say that? It's one thing to say that people in the Vineyard Church and this Pentecostal denomination believe that, but what would happen if I asked Lutherans and Presbyterians, which is, as you well know, you're not really rewarded in your church for saying, hey, God told me to park in the south ramp instead of the north ramp. Usually people look at you kind of funny. So I went and did interviews just with 12 people. I was doing this research method called life history interviewing, where you write about 6 big questions, you record your conversation, and you just allow those questions to take you where you will. You have a good conversation, then you transcribe the interviews and you look for themes. So what's fascinating, kind of side point, is that every Presbyterian and every Lutheran I talked to, I said, have you ever had an experience where you felt like God spoke to you, like God directed you? Every one of them, well, that's not conclusive, it was only 12 people, but every one of them said, oh yeah, I've had one or two. It was always, just one or two. It wasn't every morning. Jesus tells me to only eat toast and have orange juice. It wasn't that, but they said, yeah, one or two. What was remarkable is that every time they said that, it was this call into standing on behalf of someone else's humanity, giving a word of comfort. It was really a call into ministry in this context of sharing in another person's humanity in a significant way. So they all had these experiences. Well, I had one interview I was giving, and this woman was probably late 30s, maybe early 40s. Her name was Rachel, and she came in. It was a Sunday morning. She looked exhausted, and she looked like she did not want to be here talking to me about this, that her pastor had asked her to be interviewed by some professor from somewhere. She didn't really have time for it, but her pastor asked nicely, so she did it. So we were about 23 minutes into this 30-minute interview, and it wasn't going well. And I thought, well, sometimes you get a dud. So what am I going to do? So I thought, well, I have just one more question. So I asked her, Rachel, have you ever had an experience where you felt deeply ministered to? And ministered to such an extent that you felt like the presence of God was really there. And her whole disposition changed, and she said, I have. And I don't think I've ever told anyone this. She said, I've been telling you throughout this interview that I'm a single mom, but I never explained to you why I'm a single mom. She said, 5 years ago now, my husband went on a business trip, got on a plane in Seattle, flew to Chicago. He was gone about 13 hours. and I got a phone call. And on the other line was someone from the hotel. And they said, ma'am, I don't know how to tell you this, but our cleaning staff went into your husband's room this morning. Well, ma'am, it appears there's been some kind of accident or incident. Ma'am, your husband, he's dead. Can I please give you the address of where we've sent his body? It's at this hospital morgue. Ma'am, you're going to have to make arrangements to take his body back. She said when she was hearing this, she had an infant and a toddler. She said the whole room turned black and white. The color was just sapped out of it. And she looked at her children and she thought to herself, my life is over. How am I going to survive this? She made arrangements for her parents to stay with her children. She got on a plane. Her plan was to land in Chicago, go identify her husband's body, make arrangements, get back to the airport, get on a plane and get back. She knew no one in Chicago, but she had to do this. She said, I had to do it alone. So she had written down the address of the hospital morgue on a little business card. She got on a plane, flew to Chicago, got out at O'Hare, went down to the cab stand, gave the cabbie the address, and he drove. She said, I should have known this. I mean, I should have recognized this. But I was in grief. She said, I should have realized he didn't stop out front. He parked the car. She said, I was drowning in grief. So I walked in, and they had my itinerary. They knew when I was going to arrive. And as soon as I got there, they immediately took me back. She said, I stood in this sterile white room waiting for my life to end. She said, I stood there, and they wheeled in this gurney, and there it was, a body under a sheet. She said the man reached, grabbed the sheet to pull it back, and she said, my heart beat. I didn't know what was going to happen next. She said, pulled it back, and just as he pulled it back, she said, I felt a hand on my shoulder, and an arm came around front with a water bottle. And she started to cry, and she said, it was the cabbie. She said, I never felt more ministered to. I was never more sure that God would not abandon me. She said, I got on that plane, and I knew my life would never be the same, but I knew God was faithful. I knew that God would see me through this. Just think of the kind of formation it takes to have someone in your congregation who's that cabbie. Think of the kind of formation it takes and needs to have that man in that cabbie who just spontaneously, by the calling of the Holy Spirit, went in there, who needs a community to share what happened at work this week. Why that feels so full of meaning. To need a community to say, yeah, God was calling you and moving within that. God is acting and speaking and leading us. Need those communities. If he doesn't have a community to do that, what does that experience become? It easily gets downgraded to just some weird thing I did. Not an absolute holy moment that was in a movement of cross to resurrection. Join this woman in her death experience as an incredible act of faith to participate with her in the possibility of new life springing forth. And I think that's what faith becomes, both with our young people and with adults, is teaching them to narrate these experiences, but then to narrate them in the shape of the very life of Jesus Christ himself, to move from death into new life. And I think that's what Paul really means, and what Paul really thinks faith is to continue to articulate your death experience and the death experiences of the community, and to continue to lean in and to experience Jesus Christ coming to us at the cross, bringing new life out of death. That becomes in many ways Paul's experience. Paul calls his communities to always live in humility so that it might see that God moves in brokenness, in death. And when we come and we participate in God's ministry there, something new springs forth. So in many ways, the start of faith formation is exactly where we ended the first lecture. It's teaching people to wrestle in the dark. Not because the dark needs to be glorified. We pray that in the eschatological fullness that the dark will be made no more. But because this God that we serve, this God who's represented to us fully in the person of Jesus Christ, is found in dead places, working new life out of death. And so the minister's always called to share in the humanity of those up against the death experience. And in many ways, that's faith. To echo Bonhoeffer in 1937 when he gave a confirmation sermon to his last confirmation class, he had an adjective for faith. So the only adjective we can ever put in front of faith is weak. Faith is always weak, and no more so than in a secular age. And by weak faith, what it means to form people is to just give them enough faith to make it through today. Faith is like manna. If you try to accrue it, if you try to bank it, it will spoil. So to a next generation, usually we think of youth ministry. The point of youth ministry is we give them enough faith now that when they go to university, they can live off the accrued interest of all the faith we've banked in them through their primary school and their secondary school. But that will only lead to spoil. We need to teach our young people and their parents to have the practices, to have the vision, to have enough faith to get through today. And if they can get through today with enough faith, they'll know how to get through tomorrow with enough faith. There's a humility in all this, and especially in a secular age. The humility is to be communities who pray, who tell each other stories, who suffer with one another, and who anticipate God's action in and through it all. Let me pray for us. God, we are thankful. We are thankful for our confusion. We are thankful that we're anxious about this church. We're anxious about our futures. But even now, Lord, we're aware that you are responsible for it, that we can trust you to move and to work. And so we ask for enough faith, a weak, humble faith, to trust you with the church, to trust you with our parish, to trust you with our young people. So give us eyes to see the working of your presence in the world, and eyes to see the humanity of the people in our ministries. Amen.